Hey everyone, welcome back. So, you ready to dive deep into history again?
Always.
Awesome. Well, today we're going to be tackling something I think pretty interesting. We're looking at how different cultures throughout history viewed same-sex relationships.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? You might think it's a pretty straightforward story, but it's really not.
Yeah, it's definitely not black and white, that's for sure. There's so many different perspectives and practices out there.
It's like a kaleidoscope, really. You've got everything from acceptance to, well, brutal punishments, all depending on when and where you look.
Exactly. And to guide us through all of this, we've been checking out this really cool YouTube video about gay history. Have you seen that?
Oh, yeah. It's a great resource. It really highlights just how much attitudes have varied throughout history.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely got me thinking. Okay, so want to start our journey in ancient China.
Let's do it.
Okay, so there's this famous story, right, about Emperor A from the Han Dynasty. He was totally devoted to his male lover, Dongshan, like seriously devoted.
Oh, I know this one. It's a classic.
Right. So the story goes that one night, Dongshan fell asleep on the emperor's sleeve.
Uh-huh.
And I get this, rather than wake him up, I just cut off his own sleeve.
Wow, yeah. Talking about dedication, I mean, that's got to tell you something about their relationship, right?
Right. It definitely suggests a level of acceptance and intimacy that's, well, pretty surprising given what some people think about ancient China.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder, though, about the power dynamics at play, too, right?
Oh, totally.
Was it a purely romantic gesture, or, was there maybe some political strategy involved?
That's a good point. It's tough to know for sure what was going on in their heads.
Yeah, and that's what makes studying history so fascinating, right? You're always trying to piece together these different interpretations.
For sure. And it's a good reminder that we can't just impose, like, our modern ideas about sexuality onto the past.
Exactly. We have to try to understand each culture on its own terms. Think about the social norms, the beliefs, the power structures of the time.
Okay, that's a really important point to keep in mind. So we see this, like, seeming acceptance in ancient China. But then things kind of shift, don't they?
Yeah, they do. As you move into the later dynasties, especially the Qing dynasty, you start to see a move towards criminalizing homosexual acts.
Right, right. And I was reading that this shift in attitudes often coincided with influences from outside cultures.
That's something we see a lot throughout history, actually. The flow of ideas and beliefs between cultures can really shape those social attitudes, including those around sexuality.
Huh, that's interesting. So in China's case, it was a mix of Central Asian and Western ideas that might have contributed to the change?
Yeah, it seems that way.
Wow. It really shows how interconnected the world has always been, right? What happens in one place can totally ripple out and influence societies far away.
It really does, and it makes you realize that cultures don't develop in isolation.
Right.
But it's also super important to remember that internal factors, like social hierarchies and political dynamics, also played a role.
Yeah, true, true. So it's like this complex mix of internal and external forces shaping things. It's making me rethink that whole idea of history as a simple progression.
I think that's a good way to look at it. History's definitely not a straight line towards some endpoint. It's messy, complex, and, yeah, sometimes contradictory.
Absolutely. Okay, well, speaking of complex and contradictory, how about we talk about the Aztecs?
Oh, yeah, good one.
I was struck by how different they were from what we just talked about in China. Both ancient cultures with their own belief systems, but such drastically different views on same-sex relationships.
Definitely. I mean, we saw at least some degree of acceptance in certain periods in China, but the Aztecs, they seem to have had a much harsher stance.
Yeah, and I mean, the Aztecs weren't exactly known for being like a gentle culture in general.
You're not wrong there. They had some, shall we say, intense rituals and practices.
Yeah, intense is a good word.
Their religious practices involved human sacrifice on a massive scale. We're talking potentially 20,000 to 250,000 sacrifices a year.
Whoa, that's a lot.
Yeah, it was a huge part of their culture. So it's important to understand their severity towards those engaging in homosexual acts within that broader context.
Okay, yeah, context is definitely key, but still, their punishments were brutal.
Absolutely. The sources indicate that for men caught engaging in homosexual acts, the punishments were often, well, fatal. They involved a lot of ritualistic elements.
Like what? What did they do?
Well, the top, for instance, would typically be killed right away.
And the bottom, the video just said it was too gruesome to describe, but I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I could see why. It involved the removal of the colon and then death by burning.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
It's a grim reminder of how brutal things can get when social norms are enforced, so absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Makes you think about how different cultures can be, even when dealing with the same human behaviors.
It really does. It challenges us to step outside our modern perspective and try to understand the logic, even if it seems unsettling to us now, that shaped these societies.
Okay, so we've got China with its periods of seeming tolerance followed by criminalization, and then the Aztecs with their extreme punishments. What about the rest of pre-colonial America? Were the Aztecs an outlier?
That's a great question. It actually seems like they might have been the exception. Many other indigenous cultures appear to have had much more tolerant views on same-sex relationships.
Really? So where's the evidence for that?
Well, there's this really fascinating letter from Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, to the King of Spain.
Oh yeah, Cortez.
Right. And in this letter, he expresses his shock and disgust at what he called the abominable sin he witnessed among the indigenous people.
And by abominable sin, he meant?
Same-sex relationships. Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors brought their own strict moral code with them, heavily influenced by Christianity. They saw these practices as not only sinful, but also a threat to their authority and the social order they wanted to create.
So it's not just about cultural differences, right? It's about one culture trying to control another, imposing their worldview on a society that already had its own established norms.
Exactly. It's something we see throughout history. When a dominant culture arrives, they often try to suppress or even eradicate the existing cultural practices, especially those related to sexuality and gender.
Yeah, it's a shame. It seems like in this case, it meant cracking down on something that was relatively accepted for many indigenous communities.
Definitely. And it highlights an important truth. Sometimes contact between cultures doesn't lead to understanding. It leads to conflict and imposing values on others.
Yeah. And with the conquistadors, that often involved violence, forced conversions, and the destruction of whole ways of life.
A dark chapter in history, for sure. It reminds us how dangerous cultural intolerance can be and how important it is to respect diversity.
Absolutely. We need to be aware of our own biases when we look at the past. Okay, so we've explored China, the Aztecs, and gotten a glimpse of pre-colonial America. Where to next?
How about we head to ancient Greece and Rome? Those are cultures that are often romanticized for their acceptance of same-sex relationships.
Yeah, Greece and Rome, those toga parties in the movies always look like fun. But I'm guessing it wasn't all just open-mindedness and free love.
Yeah, you got to be careful with those Hollywood portrayals. While same-sex relationships were definitely part of life in ancient Greece and Rome, it was more complicated than what we often see depicted.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What were some of the key things about how they viewed same-sex relationships?
Well, one important concept to understand is pederasty.
Pederasty.
Yeah, it was a socially accepted practice involving relationships between an older, higher status man and a younger adolescent boy.
Okay, that sounds a lot like what we would consider an abusive relationship today.
And it's important to acknowledge that. Those relationships definitely involve a power imbalance that we can't ignore. But to really understand them, we need to look at them through the lens of the time, even if it's difficult.
Okay, so what was the logic behind these relationships? Was it just about sex?
It seemed to have been more than just that. It was often seen as a form of mentorship, with the older man teaching the younger boy knowledge, skills, even social values. It was part of becoming an adult.
So almost like an apprenticeship, but with a sexual component.
Yeah, something like that. And it's important to remember that the younger partner in these relationships often faced social disapproval. Even back then, people recognized the power dynamic could be problematic.
Interesting. There was some awareness that things could go wrong in these relationships.
Yeah, exactly. Even in cultures that seemed more tolerant of same-sex relationships, there were still tensions, contradictions, and power dynamics at play.
It makes you realize that things aren't always so simple, right?
Yeah, it's not a simple acceptance versus intolerance situation. It was way more nuanced than that.
For sure. And that complexity becomes even more apparent when we move beyond Greece and Rome and look at cultures like Japan.
You got it.
Japan, another one of those cultures that's often romanticized. But I bet their history with same-sex relationships is more than just like geishas and samurai.
You're spot on. It's more nuanced, for sure. Like in Greece and Rome, we see pederasty-like relationships in Japan, especially in monasteries and samurai culture.
Wait, really? So this wasn't just a Western thing?
Not at all. It seems like it was present in different forms across various cultures and times. But it's key to remember that each place had its own unique aspects. Like in Japan, there wasn't the same level of disapproval towards the younger partner as in Greece or Rome.
Huh. So the practice might seem similar, but the cultural attitudes could be totally different.
Exactly. It's so important to look at each historical context on its own terms. We can't just impose our own values and judgments.
Okay, so far we've covered ancient China, the Aztecs, pre-colonial America, Greece, Rome, and now Japan. It's amazing to see how many different perspectives there were. Any other cultures stand out to you?
Well, we could talk about India. Their ancient texts, like the Kama Sutra, acknowledge and even celebrate same-sex practices.
Oh, interesting. And what about Thailand?
Oh, Thailand's got a long and fascinating history with transgender identity. They've recognized ladyboys, as they're known, for centuries.
Wow, it's like every culture adds another layer to this huge tapestry of human experience.
Exactly. And it makes you realize how limited our own perspective can be if we just focus on our own cultural norms.
Okay, so we've seen how all these different cultures viewed same-sex relationships. But here's the big question. Why did things shift so drastically towards intolerance in many parts of the world?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there isn't an easy answer. Historians have been debating this for a long time.
Well, what are some of the ideas out there? What might explain this shift?
Well, one factor that's often brought up is the influence of outside cultures and belief systems.
Like what? Give me an example.
The spread of Abrahamic religions, like Christianity and Islam, played a huge role in shaping attitudes towards sexuality in lots of parts of the world.
Right. And it wasn't just them, was it? There was Zoroastrianism in India and a bunch of other belief systems with their own views.
Oh, absolutely. It was this big, complex web of cultural exchange, religious teachings, and changing social norms.
So it wasn't just one simple thing that caused this move towards intolerance.
Nope. It was a multifaceted process, with different factors likely playing a part in different places at different times.
Okay, that makes sense. History's rarely simple, right?
Right. And that's part of what makes it so fascinating. It challenges us to think critically, to question assumptions, and to embrace all those nuances and ambiguities.
Well said. All right, I think this is a good place to take a break. We've covered a lot, but we've only scratched the surface.
True that. We still have so much to unpack.
Definitely. But that's for next time.
So picking up where we left off, you might be wondering how those different attitudes toward transsex relationships, the ones we talked about earlier, how those transformed into the more widespread homophobia we see, more recently.
Yeah, it's like throughout history, there's this push and pull between cultures that were pretty open to same-sex relationships and then these forces pushing for stricter control and even condemning it.
You've hit on a really important point. Because even in those cultures where same-sex relationships were accepted, it wasn't always like total equality.
So are you saying even in those seemingly more tolerant cultures, there were still power imbalances and hierarchies within those relationships?
Exactly. Think back to that concept of top and bottom we were talking about, like in ancient Greece, China, Japan. Even when those relationships were acknowledged, there were still specific roles, expectations.
Right, that makes sense. So even if the relationships themselves weren't condemned, there were still these like unspoken rules and hierarchies that shaped how they were perceived and how people experienced them.
Exactly. And as societies became more structured, more hierarchical, those power dynamics probably played a role in how same-sex relationships were seen and controlled.
So it's like even in those more tolerant cultures, those seeds of prejudice and discrimination were maybe already there, just waiting for the right conditions to, take root and grow.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. It reminds us that social attitudes aren't static, right? They change over time depending on all sorts of pressures.
It also makes you think that history doesn't just progress in a straight line. It's more like this mix of progress and setbacks, acceptance and intolerance, all kind of like swirling around and interacting with each other.
Yeah, I like that imagery. And as we move closer to the modern era, those forces of intolerance, well, they unfortunately gained a lot of momentum.
You're talking about homophobia, right? But it wasn't just about cultural exchange and religious influence anymore. It became like institutionalized. It was the law.
Right, you're right. Colonialism really played a role in spreading and enforcing those intolerant attitudes. The European powers imposed their laws and morals, a lot of it based on Christianity, on the places they colonized.
So in many of those colonized societies, the cultural norms and practices that were already there, they were basically dismantled and replaced by a much harsher view of sexuality.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's often what happened. Same-sex relationships became illegal. And even where they weren't outlawed, the stigma, the discrimination became really deep-rooted.
It's a reminder that laws are only one part of the picture, right? Social attitudes can be just as powerful, maybe even more so, in how people live their lives.
Definitely. It's like those laws created a climate of fear. People couldn't be open. They couldn't be themselves.
And they couldn't challenge those laws and those social norms easily either, right? I mean, it took so much courage to speak out, especially when you could be punished for it.
Absolutely. But people did speak out. They fought back, even when it was dangerous.
You're talking about the LGBTQ plus rights movement. But where did that all start? I mean, was it really Stonewall in 1969, or were people fighting for these rights before that?
Stonewall was a huge moment, a turning point for sure. But people were already working towards this, advocating for equality, even when it was super risky. There were individuals, groups, fighting back, even before Stonewall.
Can you give me an example? I'm curious about those early pioneers, the people who were fighting for change when it seemed impossible.
Well, like in the early 20th century, you have groups like the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in Germany. They were one of the first to openly advocate for decriminalizing homosexuality.
Wow, that's amazing. Just to think about them doing that back then, when even admitting your sexuality could get you in huge trouble.
They were incredibly brave, and their work laid the groundwork for what came later. They showed people that it was possible to resist, to speak out, to demand recognition.
So Stonewall wasn't this out of the blue thing. It was built on the work of those who came before.
Exactly. And after Stonewall, the LGBTQ plus rights movement gained so much momentum. New organizations popped up, protests happened everywhere, and a whole new generation of activists came onto the scene. They demanded recognition, equality, justice.
It's like Stonewall broke the BAM, and all this energy that had been building up just came pouring out. It gave people the courage to come out, to be visible, to fight for their rights.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that energy, that momentum, it's continued. We've seen homosexuality decriminalized in a lot of countries, same-sex marriage legalized, and there's more acceptance of LGBTQ plus people overall.
But it's not over yet, right? There's still so much work to do to get to true equality.
You're right. Even in places that are considered progressive, LGBTQ plus people still deal with discrimination, prejudice, and violence.
It's sad to think that in some places, simply loving someone can get you in trouble, or worse.
It's a reminder that the fight for equality is global. We have to stand with LGBTQ plus people everywhere, no matter where they are.
Definitely. So legal protections are super important, but what about social attitudes? Laws can change, but changing hearts and minds is a whole other challenge.
You're right. Even with legal protections, there can still be stigma, prejudice, and discrimination.
So how do we change that? How do we build a world where LGBTQ plus people are not just tolerated, but celebrated for who they are?
I think education is key. We need to challenge stereotypes, help people understand, and create welcoming spaces in schools, workplaces, our communities.
And it's not just about teaching others, right? We need to educate ourselves too, be open to learning, listen to LGBTQ plus people, and understand their experiences.
I agree. Creating a more just world means working together. We all need to be allies, to speak up against injustice, and use our voices to support those who are marginalized.
It's like we're all writing this story together, and what we do today decides how it ends.
That's a great way to think about it. We're not just watching history happen, we're part of it.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the ongoing fight for LGBTQ plus rights, but can we go back to something we touched on earlier, the whole thing about homosexuality and spirituality?
You mean those cultures where same-sex relationships weren't just okay, but were part of their religious practices?
Exactly. What do you think? Do you think those historical examples can help us understand the relationship between spirituality and sexuality today?
It's an interesting question. I think those examples challenge those strict black and white views of sexuality that a lot of religions have had more recently. They show us that there have been different ways of understanding and accepting human experiences, including sexual orientations and gender identities.
It's like they're showing us a more inclusive spirituality where love and acceptance are at the center, not fear and judgment.
Exactly. And that message is so important right now as we try to figure out those issues of equality, acceptance, and the role of religion in our lives.
It's a message about connecting with each other, finding common ground, and making a world where everyone feels loved and valued for who they are.
That's a great way to put it. And you know what? I think this is a good spot to pause. We've gone through so much. Ancient times, colonialism, the LGBTQ plus rights movement, even those spiritual aspects of same-sex relationships.
We have, but there's still one more piece of this puzzle, right?
Yeah, we still need to talk about what's been happening lately in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights where we are now.
Right. So everyone, get ready. We're about to jump into the present and see how far we've come and what we still need to work on. Join us for the last part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've spent all this time going back and home and seeing how different cultures viewed same-sex relationships.
We've seen it all. Times when it was accepted, times when it was, outlawed.
Yeah, it's been an amazing journey. Really makes you think. But the thing is, the story of homosexuality isn't just about the past. It's about what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future, right?
You're absolutely right. That fight for LGBTQ plus rights, it's still going on. We've got a ways to go before we reach true equality and justice.
So let's talk about that. We left off with the LGBTQ plus rights movement, gaining all that momentum after Stonewall. What happened next?
Well, in the decades after Stonewall, activism and organizing just exploded. Tons of new organizations popped up, all dedicated to fighting for LGBTQ plus rights, from legal stuff to just getting people to accept them.
And what were some of the big wins during that time?
One of the huge ones was that Homosexuality started to be decriminalized in more and more countries. Remember back when the movement started, same-sex relationships were still illegal in a lot of places.
It's crazy to think about that now. It really shows how much progress has been made.
To right, but we got to remember, not everywhere is the same. Some countries have really embraced LGBTQ plus rights, but others have gotten even stricter.
Yeah, that's a good point. The fight's not over, that's for sure. So, besides getting those laws changed, what other big things happened?
Well, the fight for marriage equality was huge. A few decades ago, nobody thought same-sex marriage would ever be legal.
And now it is in a lot of places. That's incredible when you think about it. It shows how powerful activism can be.
It really is amazing. But even with all that progress, we can't forget those who are still struggling. In so many parts of the world, LGBTQ plus people are still discriminated against, attacked, persecuted, just for being themselves.
It's hard to believe that in some places, just loving someone can get you thrown in jail or worse. It's scary.
It is. It's a stark reminder that the fight for equality is global, and we need to support LGBTQ plus people everywhere, no matter where they are.
Absolutely. Okay, so we need those legal protections, but what about changing people's minds? Laws can change, but getting people to accept each other, that's tough.
Yeah, you're right. Even in places where LGBTQ plus rights are protected by law, there can still be a lot of stigma and prejudice.
So how do we change that? How do we make a world where LGBTQ plus people aren't just tolerated, but truly accepted and celebrated?
I think education is key. We need to challenge those stereotypes, get people talking and understanding each other, and make our schools, our workplaces, our communities more welcoming.
And it's not just about teaching other people, right? It's about educating ourselves too. We need to be open to learning from LGBTQ plus people, listening to their stories.
I couldn't agree more. If we want a fairer world for LGBTQ plus people, we all need to work together. We all need to be allies to speak up when we see injustice and help those who are being marginalized.
It's like we're all part of right is this big story, and what we do right now will decide how it ends.
That's a powerful thought. We're not just bystanders, we're making history happen.
Before we wrap up, can we go back to something we talked about before, that thing about homosexuality and spirituality?
You mean how some cultures actually made same-sex relationships part of their religious beliefs and practices?
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating, right? Do you think those examples from history can teach us anything about how we see spirituality and sexuality today?
I think they definitely challenged the way a lot of religions have viewed sexuality, those rigid black and white rules. They show us that there have always been different ways of looking at things, ways of understanding and accepting all sorts of human experiences.
Yeah, like a more open-minded and accepting spirituality, where love and acceptance are the most important things, not judgment and fear.
Exactly, and I think that's such an important message for today, as we try to figure out those issues of equality, acceptance, and how religion fits into our lives.
It's a message about building bridges, finding common ground, and creating a world where everyone feels loved and valued for who they are?
You said it perfectly. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. We've covered so much in this deep dive from ancient history to today. We talked about the complexities of the past, the challenges we face right now, and the hope for a better future.
It's been an amazing journey. I hope it's helped you, the listener, understand a little better the incredible diversity of human experience. Remember, history isn't just a bunch of dates and facts. It's about people, about struggles and victories, and about the fight for equality, justice, and love.
And each of us has a part to play in how that story continues. Let's learn from the past, keep hoping for a better future, and never stop fighting for a world where everyone can live freely and be themselves, no matter who they love.
That was beautiful. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep fighting for a better world. We'll see you next time. 29R9.